Well, welcome. My name is Nick Robbins. I'm the new Senior Director for Finance and Private Sector at the World Resources Institute, the WRI, and it's a real pleasure to be moderating today's session on the really critical issue of how we're going to deepen the mainstreaming of nature and biodiversity within the world's multilateral development banks, the MDBs. Clearly, I think we've seen this year that the case for mobilizing greater investment is clear both from a nature's perspective, but also from a climate and also from a people front. Um, the COP30 in Berlin really demonstrated once more that increased investment in nature is essential for climate reasons, for biodiversity, and also for our development goals. The biodiversity COP has also made abundantly clear that we need to really scale up investments to about 200 billion a year in developing countries by 2030 as part of the resource mobilization to deliver the goals of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think we all realize that this is not simply a question of increasing the quantity of nature positive finance. We need to ensure that nature protection and restoration is embedded into all financial decisions. The MDBs are, of course, crucial actors for this, and many have been working for decades really on biodiversity and nature. There's been a joint MDB framework since 2021, and this year at COP30, the MDBs released a common set of principles to track nature finance. So there's a lot going on. What we want to do today is share the latest findings from new analysis from WRI and from Nature Finance on the progress being made by MDBs in mainstreaming nature across their operations. And to do this, we'll have two of the report's co-authors, Sarah Christ, who is the nature risk lead at Nature Finance, and then Laura Balbena, manager of climate for cities, cities for forests, sorry, at WRI Clumber, who will make a short opening presentation, really give the sort of key conclusions and findings. Then we'll have a fantastic panel of practitioners who will give their perspectives on how MDBs are doing, where the success lies, and where do we need to place greater efforts. We'll have Vanessa Colau Ferreira, who's the sector specialist for biodiversity and natural capital at the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. Then we'll have Ben Peel, the Principal Nature and Climate Specialist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, and Suzanne Osment, the Senior Policy Advisor for Global Biodiversity and Infrastructure from the Nature Conservancy, TNC. Very sadly, Carolina Diaz-Giraldo, who is from Colombia's National Planning Department, couldn't join us today for some urgent matters. Importantly, there's a chance, obviously, for you to ask your questions and contribute to the discussion. Please use the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that all the time. The panelists and presenters will potentially be answering those live in written format, but we also have a Q&A session. So please be active in your comments and questions. And then we'll close in about an hour and a half. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is ask Laura to kick us off with the opening presentation to really set the scene about where we stand in terms of mainstreaming nature and biodiversity in the MDBs. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning and good afternoon to all. Thank you for joining today's webinar. As Nick mentioned, Sarah and I will present the findings of this recently launched paper on behalf of our other fellow co-authors, Caroline and Valerie. Next slide, please. So our research is the first assessment of its kind. We examined how the 9 multilateral development banks that signed the joint statement on nature, people, and planet in 2021 are mainstreaming nature. And what we did was identify gaps between current practices and the role envisioned for MDBs under the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. In this paper, we define nature mainstreaming as embedding nature across all aspects of MDB's work, right? These can include their policies, analyses, investments, and operations. And this is done with the goal to drive a shift toward nature positive, sustainable development. And when we think of nature mainstreaming, we also want to think when this is successful, right? So we're defining success in the terms of the research as When nature mainstreaming is implemented effectively, this approach can reshape investment portfolios, strengthen how MDBs engage with clients, and play a critical role in halting and reversing biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. For this research, we developed a tailored analytical framework to assess how MDBs approach nature mainstreaming across 4 different dimensions, which you can see on the first column. The 4 mainstreaming dimensions we use are discourse, collaboration, projects and programs, and financial allocations. And what we did was compared current multilateral development bank practices against a set of suggested actions derived from the COP16 decision on resource mobilizations, which basically serves as flexible guidance to support Target 19 of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. What we did was identified gaps between current practices across MDBs and the role envisioned for them, which you can see here on column 2. For more detail regarding the analytical framework, please refer to the working paper, which is publicly available, and the link will be shared via the chat. And so our recommendations are based on findings from applying this framework with a great literature review, semi-structured interviews with MDB staff and experts on nature and nature finance, and the data analysis we did using the Nature Aligned tool by Nature Finance. So now I'll hand it over to Sarah, who will go over the Nature Aligned tool. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Laura. So given the context that Nick and Laura have given, I'm going to give you a quick overview about one of the ways that we looked at MDB's mainstreaming nature in the WRI paper. So we used the Nature Aligned tool developed by Nature Finance to assess MDB's financial commitments with respect to nature. Nature Align is a toolkit that is intended to help financial actors align their financial flows with nature positive outcomes. It has several steps or modules that we're developing, and the first one is a free to use web application that we launched last year, and it's intended for private financial institutions in terms of the user interface, but the methodology is actually transferable to other financial actors, including development finance institutions. So it can analyze anything from investments to loans to project finance and public expenditure, as long as there is tied to this financial flow information about sectors and locations. And the way the tool works is it takes this information on sectors and locations, and it then looks at different indicators such as the state of nature or the presence of assets that are critical that deliver a lot of benefits to people, or whether there is water risk within these locations, or whether there is, for example, material dependencies and impacts on nature. And it returns this information to users. So you can see on the right-hand side a couple of illustrative screenshots that show you some of the results that the tool produces. And we're still developing it and testing it. So if you are interested in applying it, if you're an MDB or an asset manager or a bank or even a government, the option is there to reach out to us and we can have follow-on discussions about it to see how it can apply to you. And I believe a link has just been put in the chat to give you access to the tool. On the next slide, if we can move to that, I'll just focus on how we use the tool specifically for the paper that we worked on with WRI. We used data from MDBs that they report to the OECD Creditor Reporting System, the CRS database, and it basically allowed us to analyze nearly $600 billion in financial commitments between 2019 and 2023. And the assessment of financial commitments as opposed to disbursements is something that's consistent with the recently updated MDB Common Principles for tracking nature finance. So you can see on the right-hand side the table that shows the different MDBs that we included in our assessment, which are basically the ones that issued the joint statement on nature, people, and planet in 2021. And you can see that we analyzed a subset of the finance that's reported in this database, which accounts for 80% of the total amount reported. And that's because we focused on the top 50 sectors within our analysis so that we can focus on the most material sectors and make our analysis proportionate, basically. And that covers over 120 countries overall and the 50 sectors I mentioned. So for every MDB, we looked at each project that they have finance committed to, and we looked at the country that's the recipient and then the sector that this finance is intended towards. And that's what we analyze using Nature Align. I'll just give you a quick few types of results just to give you an idea of what type of information we found. So we found that almost 20% of the financial commitments we analyzed were in countries with highly intact ecosystems. So that means if there are dependencies on nature tied to the projects that MDBs are financing and these ecosystems are degraded, there could be a risk there. We also found that over 30% of the financial commitments we analyzed were in countries with low ecosystem protection, which could expose projects to potential ecological risks. And we finally found that over 20% of projects were in, or of financial commitments were in countries with high risk to water availability, so high risk of water scarcity. And as we know, many things we do and depend on all rely on water. So if that's disrupted or not available, that can have an impact on the success of these projects and their effectiveness, and is essentially a risk to MDBs. So that's just a quick overview of some of the results, and I'm going to hand back to Laura to give an overview of the other results of the paper. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So now, as Sarah was mentioning, we'll go briefly over findings from the different dimensions. We'll start with the discourse dimension, which basically we defined or is defined in the paper as how MDBs recognize or promote nature linkages through institutional documents, including strengthening transparency by regularly assessing and disclosing their nature-related risks, dependencies, and impacts. Overall, what we found was that MDBs are increasingly committing to action on nature, but most have yet to set explicit nature finance targets. In fact, here on the graph, you can see that only 3 banks have these nature finance targets. We also found that no MDB clearly articulates their role in the global goal of mobilizing the $200 billion per year. But that said, about half of the MDBs have identified concrete nature mainstreaming actions that are essential for scaling investment across their different institutional documents. And some of these actions include valuing natural capital, financing instruments, strengthening countries' enabling environments, and building pipelines of investable nature projects. And so if we focus on targets, while targets alone don't necessarily guarantee progress, they can help raise ambition and help MDBs align their efforts over time and strengthen overall transparency and accountability in terms of how they're contributing to nature finance. Then targets also require measurement and reporting. So in terms of transparency, what we found is that 5 out of the 9 MDBs regularly disclose on the sustainability impacts of their investments using internationally recognized standards, but none currently use the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, even though, as Sarah was mentioning, 33% of the MDB's financial commitments are in sectors with material nature-related dependencies and impacts, right? Standards frameworks such as the TNFD can help MDBs and other actors make financial markets more resilient to nature loss and can help make the private sector more confident in assessing the risks and opportunities in nature-related investments. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of collaboration, which is defined as forming or strengthening partnerships to address impacts on nature, including across internal departments of MDBs. So we focused on how MDBs are collaborating both internally and externally across three themes, which you can see here on the slide. First theme is on building knowledge and capacity. Then we have country demands, and then the harmonized tracking methodologies. We saw that MDBs are raising their internal knowledge on nature and working with international organizations, but capacity in some MDBs still remains insufficient to fully embed nature considerations across their policies, operations, and projects, and also specifically to embed nature early on in the project design. Right, so what this means is that there is still opportunity for MDB management to ensure that their teams are fully equipped to integrate the nature components throughout the project cycle. And this is tied to how MDBs can continue to help their client countries to support or implement, right, their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. In terms of raising country demand, we need to keep in mind that MDBs respond to the needs of their client countries, but MDBs should work with them to show how investing and protecting nature can provide economic benefits for the countries, and also help them strengthen their enabling environments to be more conducive to nature finance. MDBs have formalized collaboration on nature through a working group and have agreed on common principles to define and track nature positive investments. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago at COP30, the MDBs launched harmonized principles and methodologies, including a common taxonomy to enhance transparency and ensure consistent reporting. And I'm sure we'll cover these on the panel later on. Right, so basically in terms of the collaboration aspect, this collaboration exists. It has been going on for a while, but there is still room, especially to keep building that capacity in terms of nature knowledge, both within the banks, but also helping countries understand what benefits they might see if they continue to invest in nature. Next slide, please. Now we'll dive into the programs and projects dimension, which basically looks at how MDBs integrate nature into their activities, including through existing policies. For this dimension, we focused on understanding how MDBs are adjusting their portfolios and practices to identify and address nature-related opportunities, challenges, financial risks, and impacts with a view to progressive alignment with the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And as Sarah had mentioned earlier, for these we use the Nature Align tool. Generally speaking, results show that each MDB will face different challenges in identifying the risks and impacts they can have or are having. Right, we found that on average, 20% of commitments analyzed per bank supported projects in the 8 sectors with the greatest nature-related dependencies or impacts. For example, or how we interpret these results is, right, some MDBs operate more heavily in sectors that can deeply impact nature, such as roads and railways or the waste management sectors. So in fact, the construction of roads and railways is the sector with greatest nature impacts that we found in our analysis. This was also mentioned by Sarah earlier, but just to bring it here, right? MDB's client countries may also have more or less interest in conserving nature. We found that an average of 30% of financial commitments per bank between 2019 and 2023 were in countries with low ecosystem protections. Overall, MDBs will need to account for these risks and direct resources to manage them. And we've seen that they're already doing so by generating upstream evidence on the value of nature and supporting transboundary partnerships and cross-sectoral initiatives. For example, the Natural Capital for African Development Finance seeks to support green economies by mainstreaming natural capital in the African Development Bank's development finance operations. And then these approaches for valuing the benefits of natures will ultimately make it easier for MDBs to justify nature investments and design innovative financial solutions and will also help them, if we go back to the collaboration aspect, really help them in their conversations with their client countries. Next slide, please. Now, finally, in terms of the financial allocations dimension, right, we focused on, it's defined really as funding to address nature loss or degradation. Sorry, funding to address nature loss and for nature-based solutions. In 2022, right, MDBs and other multilateral institutions accounted for 5.7 billion of the total 15.4 billion in international biodiversity finance, which showed an increase from 2021, but it's still short of reaching the target we have even by 2025. So from our research, what we found was detailed data for tracking the beneficiaries of international biodiversity finance are lacking, but MDB's programs are showing the potential in improving access to nature-related finance to these different groups by supporting local groups through domestic financial institutions, right? We also found that flagship initiatives of MDBs, or the way in which MDBs are financing projects that have nature components or that are solely focused on nature, often combine modalities and different financial instruments. For example, there is, right, technical assistance, loans, guarantees, results-based finance. And overall, all these modalities are used to address barriers that still exist to nature investments, right? And by generating these alliances with other agencies, such as bilateral agencies, multilateral funds, domestic financial institutions, and subnational entities. And then we also found that MDBs, as part of their mandate, right, they are supporting their countries also with their enabling environments, right, to incentivize and scale nature finance, but accounting for the benefits of nature-related investment still remains a critical barrier to scale, access, and effectiveness, right? I think we've seen this throughout, we saw this throughout the entire research, and I've mentioned it throughout the presentation. There is still room to increase knowledge in terms of valuing natural capital, but also valuing the benefits that protecting, conserving, restoring nature might have, and also standardizing these metrics. Standardization also plays a key aspect, right? That means using uniform use of terms, definitions, and documentations for clarity, comparability, and investor confidence, right? But this is still seen as a challenge to scaling nature investments, as I've mentioned, right, due to the complexity, variability, and context specificity of the ecosystem services. Next slide, please. So to finish off, we found that MDBs have made progress in mainstreaming nature and biodiversity, but there are still important gaps between ambition and delivery. By clarifying, setting measurable targets, embedding nature across strategies, operation, and finance, keep working on valuing natural capital and measuring impacts of nature investments can translate global commitments, specifically those in the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, into country-level action and play a decisive role in helping close the biodiversity finance gap. Thank you, and back to you, Nick.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks, Lara, for that really rich analysis. And I'd urge all people online to really look at the working paper that was produced and released a few weeks ago. What I'd like to do now is really go to our panelists and get your reactions to both the findings that were made and the recommendations for action. And if I could start with you, Vanessa, from the IDB, how did you, was this a sort of a fair and true analysis you saw in terms of the mainstreaming activities, and what were your sort of main takeaways from the research?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting the IDB to be part of this super important conversation. And the report, in the process to build the report, is really important to inform MDB's work and IDB work specifically. I think The most important information for us is that it feedbacks into our process of continuous improvement. So right now we are writing our new action plan, which will be for implementation for the next 4 years. And definitely the information and the gaps, potential gaps pointed out in the paper can inform our new action plan and our TFD. I think IDB particularly, it's doing well across all the topics mentioned, but there is always room for improvement or room for better clarification of what we are doing in future writing papers that we develop. And for the group, for the MDB's working group, that we also have an agenda there, it's also very informative to address through the working group how we can better engage and develop new knowledge products for the MDBs and for the market.
Okay, and then over to you, Ben, at the EBRD. How did you sort of find both the conclusions, the recommendations? They're very, very rich across these areas, the 4 areas that Lara went through.
Yeah, and again, thank you very much for having me today. And yeah, fully agree with what Vanessa said as well in terms of kind of how this can be informative and really, yeah, I think what I saw there in terms of the framework and the holistic structure of it to kind of look at how this can be done across multiple different areas of action was, I think, really rich and helpful as well there to kind of say how this can not only be looked at in one area, but how we can look at this across the board. And I think that speaks to a lot of our focus and what's brought out here in terms of the need for that kind of capacity building, both on the internal side and then looking out, because I feel, we as MDBs have done a lot of the legwork on foundational aspects, the technical side, the tools and kind of underlying principles as was highlighted as well that need to be there. And, now that there is a switch of gear that's obviously important to look at how do we get this out and across our institutions, but also out to our kind of key stakeholders, governments we're working with, other clients, and out into a wider scope of stakeholders, because through from this work under a common area in the recommendation for ourselves as there's a shift in gear as to say how we can go take the next step on increasing the support and discussion of nature across those multiple levels. So I think that for me it really spoke to me in terms of what our focus areas are going to be in the years ahead.
Okay, very good. And to you, Suzanne, how did you find what was said? Did that sort of align with how you're seeing the state of practice within the MDBs?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And just I froze for a second. Congratulations to the authors on this study. Useful. And I want to stress how useful in terms of the global nature, finance, and policy discourse in this moment. I think Laura already covered, that the Global Biodiversity Framework, which aims to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, like virtually end the biodiversity crisis by 2030, is reliant on resource mobilization, right? And governments have set targets around mobilizing 200 billion per year in investment for nature finance. Also set a target that sometimes gets left out, $500 billion in subsidies reform to end harmful subsidies that harm the environment by 2030. And we're tracking progress. And there's a lot to be hopeful about, but we are not on track right now. And at COP16, the Convention on Biological Diversity showed that they are relying on support from the MDBs. So this is the first thing that gives an idea of how MDBs are envisioning and are currently these resource mobilization challenges, right? And it highlights these opportunities, these really promising opportunities to help sharpen and accelerate the pace. So I think it's really meaningful. I think for me, the most important conclusion was the range of recommendations, how MDBs can move beyond isolated projects and initiatives on nature finance to really centering nature in big economic decisions with their clients. It sort of a basket of tools and instruments that MDBs can use from into country strategies to their lending even as advisors and providing diagnostics for economic planning. It's that constructive partnership that we're hoping to see from MDBs going forward that will help countries and governments and other clients also make the transition from current state of play to what we need to be to really halt and reverse biodiversity. I really enjoyed the paper and we're planning on using it a lot.
That's the right response to it, enjoying a paper. That's really good. That's really good. And it would have been really good to have Carolina from Colombia, I think, picking up that point, so that as you say, to really root the work of the MDBs in the country, economic planning and so on. But if I could go down a level, Vanessa, and come back to you at the IDB. I mean, maybe just to give us a sense of how you are really strategically embedding biodiversity and mainstreaming nature into your operations, including in your sort of country engagement programs throughout the Latin American, Caribbean region. Give us a sense of how this is really translating into real operations across your bank.
Sure. I think IDB, first of all, we have biodiversity and natural capital included in our new institutional strategy, which was launched in 2024, the annual meeting. And that strategy sets the topic as a focus for vertical investment, so investing directly in conservation, restoration, but also continuing the work cross-sector, mainstreaming. So both are building on that. Our team already has an action plan. Currently, we are updating, and we are also now, we have grown as a team. We are a unit. We tripled in size over the last year, and beyond our people within the specific units, we have a capillarity to work in the region because of the mainstreaming with experts from all the sectors in the bank, right? And our action plan, our strategy is built in 4 pillars. The first one is country strategy. So building on what you've mentioned already in the panel, really talking with countries and aligning nature finance with development goals across sectors, including mainstreaming from the country programming in what will mandate their programming over the next 4 or 5 years. That's where we first step. Second, we integrate into operations. So we look at our pipeline and we see what are the most strategic opportunities to create huge impact in nature, be mainstreaming, be nature positive. Third, we help develop knowledge and capacity building on specific gaps in terms of knowledge, such, for instance, advancing natural capital approach or finding the number that needs to be financed in to achieve the 30 by 30 goal. So where is the finance? Where does it come? How much will it cost? Next, we're gonna find what is the gap for the 100% finance gap for each country. So really develop policies and investment projects based on robust evidence. And finally, we combine all our instruments in innovative solutions so we can de-risk operations, create enabling environments, create feasibility for markets, and bigger uptake of private finance into nature finance. So these are our 4 pillars, and we focus on working with all the sectors. Our key stakeholders are ministers of finance. In Carolina, Colombia is one of our key stakeholders that we've been working with because they provide a whole of economy approach, looking at budget economies and looking at national accounting stream in real economy sectors, working with agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism. So how nature can be seen as wealth, as contributing to developing to development goals across sectors. So this has been the way that we have been working and will continue to work this way.
Super. Is there an example which you could do which expresses particularly the sort of the country level approach and how this really gets delivered on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So let me give you an example of what the work we've been doing with Colombia. So we have a operation with funded by the JEF and with experts from the Natural Capital Project within the Stanford University. We are working with 5 pilot countries. Each country chooses how they want to the ecosystem or the region that they want to work with in their pilot. Then we develop ecosystem services assessments. So which sectors, economic sectors, benefit from the ecosystem services from that area. Then we develop the valuation based on the benefits seen by those economic sectors or by the municipalities, such as the case of Colombia. And then we develop the valuation, and from that, we go the step further. We don't stop at the approach. We actually use this study to inform policy and inform investments. Of Colombia, for instance, we developed this with the DNP, right, with the National Planning Department. We assess ecosystem services, specific conservation areas from the Andes upstream, and how the ecosystem services from there were benefiting key economic sectors in 3 key municipalities downstream. And then we came up with the percentage of the GDP of these municipalities and the revenues from fees and taxes from these municipalities that were related to those. And that will inform now mechanisms to compensate financially the communities upstream that are around those conservation areas, that help preserve those conservation areas. So we go beyond the environmental ministers. We are talking with planning, we are talking with finance, and we are talking with municipalities. And that's a way that we work. So mainstreaming and connecting the economic sectors, energy, tourism, water, that are beneficiaries that clearly see the ecosystem services, but we bring them numbers so they can see, and they can see the reasoning to be part of the financing the conservation areas. I think, does this clarify?
Super, and it's always really good to link these sort of analytical and valuation aspects, which are actual real investment decisions. So that's really helpful. We've mentioned a few times the importance of being able to track nature finance and the common principles which were launched in Belém. I think you were piloting this at the IDB. You've been piloting this process. Maybe give us a sense of how this has gone about, the challenges, but also I think you've also been working with sort of private sector finance practitioners in terms of nature metrics and so on. It'd be really good to see how this question of sort of tracking finance is coming to life in your work. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So the tracking finance builds on the knowledge that our institutions had already developed for tracking climate finance, and previously to have principles from MDBs, we had developed a green finance tracking methodology for the IDB. And then when the principles first came, we integrated the principles to the green finance methodology so we could pilot the principles. And that piloted were the numbers that were disclosed in COP16 in Cali for our nature finance, and were the baseline where we could track from that on. This year at COP30 in Belém, we also disclosed our numbers for 2025 up to the third quarter, which are 10% of the investments of IDB were to finance, were for nature finance, and it's 1.5 billion up to the third quarter. So from that, we can start building new targets for the new upcoming action plan, and we can see the sectors that have been more easy to identify for nature finance, and other sectors that we need to improve maybe our systems and our process so we can track from the beginning specific finance that goes to nature. For instance, nature-based solutions not always necessarily are clarified as a separate expense. They are maybe within the infrastructure investment. So we need a clear tagging there so that it's easier to track nature finance at the end. And for that, we need to work with project developers within the bank in the project design so we can clear identify from the beginning. And the taxonomy developed for the nature principles helps on that. So we can clear signal what activities go for nature finance. So this process of piloting, as is with climate, every time you have a methodology, we implement, we pilot, we find how our systems, how our process, how our teams need to improve so we can better track. And that has been the process. So for next year, we are gonna improve process, reflecting the lessons learned of piloting the principles, the data principles and the taxonomies. We increase the resources for nature tracking. We're gonna do not end of the year, we're gonna do throughout the year. And we're going to update our green finance methodology based on the taxonomy too. And as for your second part, for the second part of your question on the nature metrics, the MDB heads in 2024 came up with a viewpoint note, and they had a few deliverables in there from the reforms of the MDBs. One of the deliverables was to come up with a stock take on the metrics to measure impact on nature finance. And so the MDBs collectively developed this knowledge product that first came with the stock take of metrics, because what we realized is that NGOs, universities, MDBs, investors were developing their own metrics. And then it was really hard to get comparability and to actually know which one was creating better impact or was measuring impact. So the stock take helped us understand what was in the market and what we could build from there to allow more comparability. And we knew for investors to know their impact and to compare, there is an uptake with finance, right? So beyond the stock take, we came up with this voluntary guidance that helps investors understand the kind of metrics they need is on the drivers of nature degradation, is on policies that will create change for the enabling environment. And this is because nature keeps being very context-based. We don't enforce any metrics, and also it changes according to the instrument. So each investor can check what is the best way to track their impacts, what are they targeting, and then follow this thread to the end of the project, understand the impact of their nature. And this product was launched, this knowledge product was launched by the MDBs also at COP Belém. In less than 2 weeks after the launch, we already had 40,000 downloads in the publication, which is a huge number. And that's only accounting for the IDB website that we track, right? The other MDBs also probably have other downloads. So it shows a huge interest from the market in using the metrics. We have also been looked for different alliances of investors, ESG impact investors and institutional investors wanting to know how they can pilot these metrics and integrate it into their work. So it shows the market needed, and this will help unlock finance for nature and crowding private sector, which is super important.
So a lot of people are going to be a lot of reading over the Christmas break. That's what you're telling us. Ben, if I could turn to you in London with that glorious sunny River Thames behind you, staying with this point about the common principles and so on, could you give us a sense at EBRD, given your business model and regional focus, how you've been operationalizing these tracking process and the taxonomy process?
Yeah, I think the the lift probably has been less than some other MDBs. For us, it's somewhat of an evolution in terms of the operationalization, because at EBRD we've been looking at sort of environmental finance under different names and sort of ideas for a while. Partly that's been obviously driven by, integrating a lot of things around like the EU taxonomy into the way in which we invest under our kind of green finance approach, but also in recognition of a lot of the needs of the countries that we work in. So I think this is also highlighted by the report, but for us working a lot in, Central Eastern Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, these are areas where there's significant degradation of nature. There's a long history of like heavy industrialization, which has left obviously a lot of places needing significant recovery of nature as opposed to, let's say, a focus on conservation and protection. That's also resulted in a large social cost of that as well, from the questions on water quality, water availability, but also just broader kind of pollution issues as well. So from both the demand side and also the need to kind of respond to those concerns. From our side, we've had a long track record of that environmental finance that is focused on things like wastewater treatment, waste management, circular economy, all these things to try and tackle these issues at source. And as a private sector focused institution, a lot of those are sitting in that kind of public-private kind of space on either municipal level or kind of private sector actors who are like driving a lot of those kind of potential areas of nature loss. So for us, it's been a strong kind of historical thing for us to track this kind of these things that are tackling environmental issues. The nature finance principles and the taxonomy have allowed us to evolve that approach to basically say, these things are still important, but there's a lot more on the table for us now when we look at nature more broadly and the ways in which we can contribute to the GBF, across a great range of activities. So I guess what that means is organizationally, we had the setup to be tracking nature finance, identifying these projects, understanding what we had already in the pipeline. And that represented something in the region of 10% of our bank volume. And a lot of these were also climate co-beneficial projects. When we're all talking about the water system, there's a lot of things that are both kind of solving adaptation problems as well as they're solving nature issues. So those foundations are in place, and you'll see that in our latest green finance attribution and tracking approach that was published by the EBRD, we've more explicitly integrated nature in the common principles and taxonomy. And equally in our new green finance or green strategy that's currently under public consultation at the moment, we've also been clear on kind of how nature fits into that in a more clear manner. So as I say, organizationally, that means on the nature finance tracking side, we had the tools, systems to go for it. The problem is more around how do we build that capacity and build the understanding of how much more comes into the mix as a result of the common principles, right? And making sure our teams and our colleagues have that understanding of nature finance is there to tackle a broader set of drivers of nature loss than we were maybe looking at previously, and equally those things that are more leaning towards protection, conservation, nature-based solutions. These things are all going to be a greater focus for us. So it's, as I say, trying to widen the mindset as much as possible is kind of the real focus for us, as opposed to the tools and underlying processes. So I think it's a positive thing to go out to our colleagues and be like, there's more things we could be doing for sure, as opposed to kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of how do we track this and putting the processes in place.
Yeah. No, good. The tracking is obviously key. Maybe going into the particular business model, MDBs often have quite similar approaches, but the EBRD is particularly focused on the private sector and lending to the private sector. Obviously, you have intimate relationships with governments and so on. Translate this focus on mainstreaming into your relationships with private sector operations, with banks, with companies, SMEs, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the core things is for us to mainstream that nature component into how we're building sustainability governance and practices across the kind of corporates and banks that we're working with, to make sure as it's something that we mainstream in our own organization, is to make sure that becomes a bigger component of how we're engaging with those institutions, so that this comes from the top down in terms of how we're providing the technical assistance and support in understanding their risks and dependencies impacts as well. So for us, it's partly a piece of integration into how we're engaging on building that corporate understanding of and private sector understanding of what nature is doing. I think the other aspect that's very important is evolving our product mix when we talk with banks, because I think there's an understanding of, you know, we need to help build the pipeline so that we can finance it when it comes to a lot of our work with local and domestic banks. So a lot of that is similarly capacity building on what are the types of projects, and in the detail of helping them understand with their project teams, what do these nature finance projects look like? How can we build a sizable pipeline with you so that it becomes a bankable pipeline that we can then support? So there's a lot of that upstream work to basically build the pipeline so that we can finance it. The other thing I would say is on the product side is really understanding that with a lot of the private sector, the challenge is scale of individual nature investments. You know, not everything is going to be a big CapEx project finance piece. There will be these big nature-based solutions that come across every so often, major kind of municipal infrastructure. But a lot of it is changing in practices, changing in how, you know, existing like land banks are managed, or changes in the way that operations are managed are run. So for us, it's really been evolving what we had been doing on sustainability linked finance, results-based finance, to show that this is a real important vector for nature in particular for us as we talk to our clients, because the more we can do to focus on how we change the overall corporate practices through our finance and provide the right incentives to do so, you know, the more it helps to align with kind of the actual investment cycle for nature investments, which is typically going to be less CapEx oriented and more OpEx oriented than what we've seen on some of what we've done on climate finance in the past. So that's the other thing, is bringing these products more to the fore and putting them as the kind of front foot that we do on nature as well. And while we have a lot of that private sector focus, I would say there's still a very big importance of working with governments, working with donors to build the platforms for investability and basically bringing the right support into those projects to help with mobilization, bringing other investors on board with them. For us, I think that the key thing there is identifying what is the real, and it comes back to what was being talked about on like valuing nature capital, you know, things like that. Is nature is a broad topic, but most of these platforms get built off identifying very specific risks to economic growth and regional economic dependencies on nature. Not talking about nature as a whole, but talking about where the specific losses are going to be coming from and why that's the biggest connector to kind of growth and resilience in economics in the region. So that, whether that's what we're doing in the Mediterranean to look at like how, you know, dependent a lot of those sectors across the Mediterranean are dependent on I guess the Mediterranean itself and the loss of nature that has already occurred and that continues to occur. But equally in our Central Asia nature partnership that we're working with governments there, the focus is much more on water security. You know, that's the big driver of economic dependency and is linked to nature. So water may be the big upfront issue, but it's tied into an understanding of when we look at valuing nature, this is where the losses are significant, but also where economic activity is fundamentally tied to managing that resource and how we can work with it through these partnerships. So that's the other thing for us, is making sure that when we talk about nature, we can do it as a broad level and institutionally, but when we come to talk to those at the regional level, talking with governments, we're very clear on tying it to what are the specific factors that are really going to make or break the kind of change, you know, actual seeing recovery in the local ecosystems, but also building that economic resilience over time.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And the Mediterranean, is that a particular, like I asked Vanessa, but is that a good example of the platform you have there of how this comes to life? Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, we talk about the challenges of transboundary impact a lot when we talk about nature finance, is that, you know, nature and ecosystems don't worry about boundaries. They don't worry about you know, where the regional boundaries are drawn, and ultimately, you know, countries are either all dependent on the same ecosystem or have those impacts that kind of cross boundary and then cause risks and impacts to others. And looking at the Mediterranean more holistically and saying which governments are surrounding the sea and ultimately all going to be impacted, who can pull resources into that so that we can invest collectively to build resilience in that ecosystem. Because I think if we did that piecemeal, at the end of the day, most of those it's just not realistic to see how those projects get owned by individual countries or individual donors, things like that. Pooling resources at the same level as the size of the ecosystems we want to engage with, I think, is really critical there in terms of kind of making sure all interests are aligned when it comes to those broader partnership opportunities.
Super. Well, thanks, Ben. We'll come back to you in a bit. So, Suzanne, let's turn to you in terms of the work which TNC obviously has been doing for many years in this arena. We've highlighted in the report, Nature Finance WRI did the role of CSOs. Where do you think civil society organizations can really play a key role in this mainstreaming process and support MDBs as they seek to hit the goals we need for 2030 and beyond?
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Well, certainly, first and foremost, CSOs are rooting for MDBs on this, right? We want to see MDBs successful on this topic, and I think a lot of civil society organizations are ready and willing to help where it makes sense. Within TNC, you're right, Nick, we've done a lot with MDBs in the past. TNC has conducted numerous trainings and technical assistance programs with MDBs, particularly on nature-based solutions and integrating that into infrastructure sector. Also, we've done deals with MDBs like IDB, for example, on nature bonds, which are, I think, a really remarkable product. Looking ahead, I think one thing CSOs are interested in is how this new taxonomy is going to work, right? It's the common principles and taxonomy are just a very significant achievement in building the framework that's necessary to really scale nature finance. But it's an entirely new approach, right? So I think we want to make sure that these practices add up to the change that we need. CSOs can help a lot with data. I think historically, MDBs are not often long-term partners on monitoring impacts of projects over time. That's a role that CSOs often do play in partnership with governments or communities, right? So to figure out what's going to work and what's not working, we need that long-term data on project performance. I think that's something that TNC and other civil society organizations are really interested in understanding. We can also help with pipeline development. Now that this taxonomy exists, I think Vanessa and Ben both pointed out, like there's a need for clients to demand these types of nature finance projects. And, I think there is a fundamental thing I'd like to get across here, which is that a lot of nature finance projects do not materialize within like a 12-month time span at this time. Anyway, maybe, in the future we'll get better at it, but MDB project cycles for 6 to 12 months, they don't provide enough runway to necessarily build the community engagement or to figure out the transboundary issues like Ben was pointing out. So if civil society understands where MDBs and their clients are setting investment priorities for nature, I think civil society will be a constructive partner in helping tee up that pipeline so that we can support in terms of building that runway of nature finance deals. And so those are a couple examples of where I think there could be productive partnerships on operationalizing this work going forward.
Fantastic. And for all our audience, thanks for your questions so far. I'm just giving you a heads up that it's going to be your turn soon. We're going to be answering questions. So please do put any more questions you have online. And so, Suzanne, you also been doing research yourself, and you've been doing some research looking at biodiversity finance trends. What do you see as particularly important from the work you've been doing in terms of those trends and the outcomes that have come out from this piece of analysis from WRI Nature Finance, particularly in terms of the mainstreaming aspects? What are the sort of the key sort of successes and bottlenecks that you're identifying?
Thanks. Yes, that's right. TNC and partner with DEFRA from the UK government on a biodiversity finance trends dashboard, which I can put into the chat in a minute. But it's a work that my colleagues have championed to provide an overview of where we are globally on nature finance. Are we making progress and in which ways? Because we know that this is a complex landscape and there's multiple actors that need to be taking action. So we do have this overview. And absolutely, I think that a key takeaway from it is the important role that MDBs can play in mainstreaming nature with their clients, but also in maximizing finance through engagement with private investors, right? There's actually a lot of inspiring success stories about how innovative financial instruments can mobilize private finance, like when the projects are structured well. But from my experience and having been involved in, a handful of those, I can tell you that those examples often take years to design and negotiate. And what we need now is scale, I think. We need to be able to scale successful models. And so in my view, the financial engineering that MDBs can play is so important, but nature finance will remain niche until we're able to develop the policy frameworks that really support nature finance at scale. And so, for example, like successful nature finance projects need secured cash flows. And that's really a policy issue. Governments can take action to say water tariffs can be dedicated to nature-based solutions investments. Regenerative agriculture is only financial viable if there's going to be an incentive structure, often dictated by governments, that makes it so. And so, I really think I mentioned this earlier on, but I think that we are counting on MDBs to help unlock private finance, not only through the financial engineering, but on multiple fronts, including through their client engagement and advising on how the implementation of nature commitments within a country can actually generate a pipeline of, positive economic development projects. So, yes, I'd be happy to share the finance trends for 2025 in the chat and discuss them a little bit further as we go.
So I hope the participants realize that they have a major reading list on their hand. So I think this point, which has been bubbling under throughout, which really is about the financial ministry and sort of fiscal nature of sort of nature mainstreaming, nature finance mainstreaming is really important. And one of the questions I think I'd like to sort of kick off with and bring also Laura and Sarah into this is how can MDBs move forward with nature finance strategies and so on when sovereign debt is such a big issue in so many developing countries, and that was really highlighted in the sort of climate-related, but also very relevant nature of the Baku Development Roadmap. This whole question of how do we deal with the sovereign debt issues and also space issues. So I think that would be a good one to kick off with. I don't know if any people want to start with that, any work you've been doing. Obviously, we've had debt for nature swaps, which is one response. But any thoughts? I saw your head nodding, Vanessa. Anything you'd like to add on this? Don't nod your head. That's the main thing in these panels. Otherwise, you get asked the question.
No, I mean, you already mentioned the success of the debt for nature swaps, right? And we just approved a facility to increase the number of these operations at the bank. It's a facility of $40 million with JEF funding, which also includes a line to strengthen the conservation trust funds, which usually are the executing units for the funds directed at conservation from these deals. And there is also policy-based loans, an instrument that countries are very interested in, and also MDBs. There is a cap, there is a limit to the amount of PBLs that we can provide, but it's an instrument that can really lead to transformational changes if the policies that are included in the policy matrix are well structured and thought to create impactful transformations. In outcomes-based finance, we are also developing around key species so we can see the recovery of ecosystems through the monitoring of key species. One example would be the jaguar corridor, which starts in Mexico and goes down to Argentina, so throughout the whole region, or tied to livelihoods to around the Caribbean. So there are quite few instruments, but all these instruments connect, not only country dialogue, but also enabling environment, and all of them unlock and attract private sector for them. I think, not sure if I address all parts of your questions, but
Anybody else want to address this linkage, sovereign debt and nature finance mainstream? Okay. A question we have, which I think aligns with some of the report's findings, was that if we're going to get the mainstream we're seeing, mainstreaming has been ongoing for a while, but obviously we're seeing more of it. This can't just come from inside the MDBs, but needs to be a sort of signal from the bank's shareholders and also sort of client countries. So it'd be really interesting, particularly again, maybe Ben, Vanessa, and others, sort of how much you are sort of seeing this sort of pressure for upgrading your commitments on nature from your sort of sovereign stakeholder, your sovereign stakeholders, both on the shareholder side, but also on the country partner side.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in first. I think, it's definitely been an area that has been high on the agenda of interest by a number of our shareholders. And obviously that's reflected in some of the, commitments that have been made by MDBs collectively, right? It doesn't happen completely in a vacuum. It's also understanding that this is something our shareholders want to support and want us to kind of be clearly responding to. I think, also recognizing that the GBF, obviously with the goals that it sets out, for many of our shareholders, MDBs are a key vector for the way in which those commitments can be delivered upon. And that's obviously, we've kind of touched on. So obviously, there's an alignment between, what the commitments are in the GBF, which countries are on the hook to kind of be the key kind of contributors to that, and what MDBs can do to kind of grow their ability to deliver on that. So, these things all line up into one. So, the more that we can have the resources and capacity to deliver on nature, the more it does ultimately support kind of the bigger kind of shareholder needs as well to deliver on those targets. And we're aligned obviously on making sure that those get done in the right way, in a way that's consistent with those countries' objectives and goals. And then I think, for EBRD specifically, one of the things is we're expanding our geographic scope. We are now becoming more active in sub-Saharan Africa, so that changes the profile of a lot of our investments significantly in terms of the potential impacts that they will have, the types of ecosystems we're working in, these types of things. So as we've been having those discussions on, changes in our strategy, changes in our regional focus, inevitably nature needs to be part of that conversation as to what are we doing to put in place the right things up front, so that when we come to see those risks and impacts down the line on the projects themselves, that we have the ability to kind of respond to those up front. So, there's a number of things where strategically this really does align with everything that we're doing kind of more generally as an MDB. It's not just kind of nature siloed to one side. And I think that's obviously the nature of the important thing in these discussions.
Yeah, no, very, very good. Any other comments on this particular point about the relationship between MDBs, both in their shareholders and their partner countries? Suzanne, Lara, Sarah? You've already spoken, Vanessa. You can jump in as well, but I just wondered if others wanted to come in. One question I'd be interested in. Please, Lara, go.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry, Nick. Yeah, I was just going to complement a bit the two answers we had. Our research focused, right, really on understanding what part of the recommendations were more focused for MDB staff directors, but then we had others that focused exclusively on shareholders, and that's right directly linked to this question, because we can't assume that MDB staff directors are going to us on to increase nature finance to the scale we need, but we really do need the MDB shareholders to really keep pushing the banks, right? As I mentioned, we focused on nature finance targets. We know that that's not necessarily going to solve all problems, but pushing for these nature finance targets from the shareholder side to the MDB side could really also support this situation in terms of helping bridge the finance gap. So just wanted to acknowledge that we do have those specific recommendations for shareholders within our report.
Great, super. Any more on this? Very good. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the nature finance agenda, which is slightly separate from climate, is that people have been part of the agenda from the beginning. That people are part of nature, and I think one of the interesting questions is how, when you're considering when the banks on the panel, Vanessa and Ben, but also the others who've been looking at analysing and supporting and working with banks, how do we properly incorporate the social and people dimension in terms of who's benefiting, and also to make sure that any harms are managed and avoided as far as possible. Human rights are respected, Indigenous peoples, and so on. So that would be really, really interesting, because this work on nature finance doesn't happen in a sort of social economic vacuum. We'd like to start with that.
I can say a bit about how we look at the people dimension within the analysis that we did. So the tool that we use to analyze financial commitments is primarily looking at nature. The one element I would say that is speaking to the kind of people or social topic is when we look at critical natural assets. So whether MDBs have financial commitments in countries where these assets exist. So that means that these are natural assets that deliver a lot of benefits to people. So there's a high dependency there, and we're basically capturing that within the analysis. I would say it's important to also think about the beneficiaries of these types of investments, and also who may be losing out as well because of trade-offs. And more generally, I would say I view this as a topic of its own, and it deserves its own data sets and tools so that it can be analyzed carefully and with sensitivity to some of the issues that come with it. So I think that's where different tools can complement each other rather than try to incorporate everything into one all-encompassing solution, which is probably never going to be good enough, essentially.
Right. And then Vanessa, Ben, from your point of view, that this question of the people dimension in terms of your nature projects, and this is obviously the theme of a just transition is not just for the energy sector, but also for the nature sector. How are you sort of thinking about this and focusing on the beneficiaries and also protecting people in your nature work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we need to kind of look at it on two sides. There's obviously those people who are impacted and on the kind of impact side, and then obviously the beneficiary side of things as well. I mean, on the impact side, I think it's something, for at least for EBRD, when we recently updated and evolved our environmental and social safeguards policy, and that includes how we do stakeholder engagement as well in our projects. One of the key things there for us was to be clear on the role of ecosystem services and enhance that within the context of how we were looking at those safeguards that we have in place on projects, understanding that there will be communities impacted not just through the loss of nature, but through the knock-on impacts on loss on ecosystem services and livelihoods and similar. So making sure that that was a more consistent part of the way in which that analysis was conducted, because sometimes things can get siloed and just looking at the sort of nature biodiversity component without looking at those knock-on impacts. So I think really drawing out that role of who is dependent on the ecosystems that we're impacting, and making sure they're part of the process, part of an open and collaborative process, and engage, and part of the stakeholder engagement ultimately on projects, to make sure that there is a broader acceptance and equally a broader understanding of how anyone who is affected is ultimately those risks are avoided, or otherwise we have mitigants in place for those. I think on the beneficiary side, that's a different piece. But I think all I would say to that before handing over to others is, one of the things is that I think on climate projects, these are very often kind of presented as, this is a green project, and the beneficiaries are kind of green outcomes. I think on nature, we're going to see a greater range of projects where the actual how the project supports development, how it ultimately supports sustainable development, is as much on the benefits it would provide to, resilience within communities, or ultimately about how it supports, new forms of like development income streams and otherwise, they're not going to be necessarily green forward projects. There's going to be as much that focuses on the economic development side that can be brought through on these projects. So I think that's another side of, a nature project won't necessarily be labeled immediately as such in all cases, maybe as well in terms of how those beneficiaries are impacted. But as I say, it's a lot. It's a big topic, and that's just kind of a first piece from me. But Vanessa or others, I don't know if you want to give your view.
Vanessa, thoughts from your side?
Yeah. So from my so first of all, I agree with everything that has been said before, and I will talk from an IDB perspective more from the nature positive, the mainstreaming side, not so much on the safeguards, which 100% agree, but from the natural capital for the mainstreaming side, a way that we approach governments and we do the country dialogue and we talk with the counterparties. It's always how nature as a wealth contributes to other development goals, such as livelihoods or employment or quality of life, health, and towards job and not only green jobs, but in general jobs, right? So there is always this side that nature as a wealth per se, but how it actually is the basis for a lot of other socioeconomic outputs. That's from a whole of economy approach. But also when we're doing project-specific approaches, we also find super and key and critical to bring the actors representing the social agenda to the table. So, for instance, we are developing a project in Ecuador for natural capital accounting. And one of the co-designers are indigenous populations from the Amazon region, which is the focus of the project. And they are on the table designing the project with the Ministry of Environment par on par. Another one is where we develop a KPIs framework that connects blue economy, fisheries, but with the livelihoods. So how do you establish quotas, or how do you think about fishing regulations, and how do you monitor biodiversity and conservation protected areas? But how does that affect livelihoods? That depends on the harvesting, on the sustainable use of those areas. So that's key, and we approach natural capital from this systemic perspective, with the nexus not only with climate and disasters, but with great focus too on livelihoods and on impact of people.
Nick, if there's a moment I would like to jump into, yeah, thanks. So I think that one of the promises of nature finance and nature-based solutions, at least, is that it will benefit people. A lot of research has found that that is not always the case, and that these projects only benefit communities when they're consciously designed to. And I think Vanessa and Ben have given really great examples of some frameworks that MDBs are using to ensure that. But Ben, you also mentioned safeguards, and they are such an important fallback mechanism to ensure that these projects are going to have the intended benefits for communities as well. I know at least the IFC performance standards, which influence a lot of other banks' standards, and the biodiversity safeguards are going to be revised next year. So I'm curious and interested to see how that will interface with nature finance initiatives within your banks. I mean, I understand that nature finance is really a category above and beyond meeting the basic safeguards. When we think about the Global Biodiversity Framework's goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss, the safeguards are very important on the halting side, right? So I think those are so important to hold the line and ensure that nature finance is going above and beyond sort of the floor of sustainable investment standards that have already been established.
Any feedback, Ben or Vanessa?
No, I think it's been something we've been very discussed a lot as well. Is that we don't want to lose sight of a lot of what's there from a foundational side on the safeguard side, and that bar also needs to, continue to respond. And as I say, we've just updated our policy last year, and our biodiversity safeguards was an important part of that in terms of understanding how that could evolve and increase. But that being said, it's the bar, and things need to exist beyond that. When it comes to nature finance, it has to go above and beyond that. But one of the things that we've taken away from that review, and also, more generally discussing this topic across, is there's still things we can learn from how that experience on the safeguards policy side, right? There's still a lot of work that happens through that, where it is either around how do we develop new protected areas, how do we enhance or improve conservation of existing areas. While these may have been triggered by needing to mitigate impact in the past, it doesn't mean that what have turned out to be effective approaches in monitoring and effective approaches during the lifetime of projects aren't transferable and aren't scalable. So one of the things that we've been looking at and learning from is how can we take the success stories from what a track record of 30 years of nature restoration and protection that's been triggered by safeguards, but apply that into how do we develop new projects and develop what we can do on nature finance, because sometimes we get a bit lost in that kind of view of this is all new, it all needs to be new and look completely different. And sometimes, we're also like, we've tried and failed a lot of things, and we've also tried and succeeded on many as well. Successes into kind of how we structure new projects going forward as well.
Great. So time is a non-renewable resource, and we're coming up to the end of our webinar. And so we'd like to look ahead. Vanessa, we already heard from you that you're coming up with a new action plan, I think, at IDB on nature next year. But really like to close by asking all of you sort of what are the top priorities. We have COP17 on the Convention on Biodiversity front. But Vanessa, maybe starting with you. So what do you see as the key sort of nature finance priorities for you at IDB and us maybe collectively going into 26?
Yeah, so we are defining, we're definitely going to continue to work on the 4 pillars that I mentioned prior. And I think more strongly, we're going to tackle the drivers of nature degradation. We have now more resources to tackle priorities across sectors. And so I think continue the work and tackle the drivers of nature degradation, continue working in the working group with MDBs and supporting Yerevan for the next COP, and supporting our own countries, the borrowing countries, on the implementation of the NBSAPs, on systems to monitor, to track what they have been doing, and to get more flow to finance their goals and improve their ambition. And beyond that, we will define together collectively within the MDBs the priorities for the group. And probably one hot topic that we might evolve individually or collectively with more studies, identification, solutions is also on targeting subsidies, harmful subsidies, and pervasive incentives. I think that's a hot topic that we might tackle with further knowledge.
Very good, very good. Sarah, to you, I mean, looking forward, obviously you've got the Nature Line tool. It'd be good to obviously see MDBs picking up that tool, but your priorities for action in the next year, please.
I think definitely it would be good to connect with some MDBs to see how the tool can be used in practice, because we only used it using public data. I want to think about how the common principles can be like operationalized in practice within tools and data that can support MDBs in what we're asking of them. And also to think about the metrics that Vanessa mentioned, which I need to catch up on my reading list and figure out how to wrap my head around. So that would be the things that I kind of can reflect on from this conversation. And I think, beyond this kind of landscape analysis that we did with Nature Align, maybe thinking about how to support MDBs more at a project level. So going down into more detail and thinking about that would be something I would look forward to doing in the coming months and time.
Fantastic. Well, people enjoying reports and looking forward to more work on nature. This is a really exciting, positive panel. So, Suzanne, your priorities for next year.
Sure. Well, we are, like Vanessa said, really invested in COP17 being a success and being an important inflection moment towards the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It is going to be a stock take where countries are submitting their reports on progress made so far. And we know it's no secret that mobilizing resources is the engine that will make implementation happen on this agenda. So, again, Vanessa, you mentioned IDB's support on looking at national biodiversity strategies and action plans. We would love to see some MDB initiatives that help, undertake the broad reforms necessary to align with GBF. Like, how can you support clients to do that? And more serious inquiry into how countries can actually create business opportunities by implementing their NBSAPs. So I was really excited by Vanessa's comments and hoping to see that type of work in the run-up to COP17, which I think will provide the momentum we need for success there.
Yeah, and maybe borrow a line from the Beleng outcome document that actually these action plans also need to be investment plans. So Ben, to you, building on these thoughts about sort of applying your common principles, seeing COP17 as a sort of trigger point for working more with your partner countries and companies.
Yeah, I mean, COP17 is a home COP for us. It's one of our countries, so obviously we're going to be heavily engaged throughout the year, supporting the presidency, supporting and figuring out how we can best bring this topic into the mix. Because ultimately, yeah, the more we can bring investment opportunity focus into the discussion, I think we always know that the finance days and similar get a lot of traction, but they also need to be focused on what is the clear things that we can all get behind, what are the kind of clear topics that are really going to get traction as well. So yeah, something we'll be very closely focused on is how we can bring the kind of biggest scalable things into the COP, I think, for me. And I think the other side really is probably, it may sound a bit boring, but really doing the principle into practice side of things is, we spent a lot of the last year focusing on talking with all the specialists, talking with all the people who know a lot about nature finance on what it needs to be and how it needs to look. But for me, the next year is a lot more taking that in and putting it in the hands of people who don't have that experience, don't have that specialty, is putting this putting the tools together, the information, everything else to build this in our bankers, our clients, our developers, to basically say, how does this more simply turn into a project for us, and how do we make that pipeline happen? Because yeah, for me, that's the big thing now that we've got a lot of this out into the broader kind of investment community, is to turn it into these kind of easy to uptake, easy to understand, and figure out, I guess, where the barriers might be in doing so.
Yeah, principles in practice is all this is about. This is the real key. And Laura, maybe I could close with you. I mean, in terms of the report, it's got really good feedback. It's got some really good analysis, but also some key recommendations. Where are you going to be putting your priorities in terms of taking forward this theme of mainstreaming nature in the MDBs?
Sure, thank you, Nick. So we definitely want to keep working with MDBs. We were really appreciative of all the time they also put into the research, right? We had different interviews across the 8, 9 MDBs with their different teams. So we really want to keep that work going. WRI, as an entity, has worked in the past with MDBs, especially the team I'm part of, right, in terms of analyzing nature-based solutions projects, how they're being financed, what are the challenges to get more finance in that space. So I think really keep the collaboration going, MDBs, other CSOs, right, and really understand what else can be done, not only from the research aspect, which I think we covered with this research paper, but really help them through hopefully implement some or all of the recommendations that we put forth in the report.
Fantastic. Implementation is key. So thanks to all the speakers and panelists, to you, Laura, to you, Sarah, Vanessa, Ben, and Suzanne. Thanks all of you for joining. The recording and the slides will be made publicly available, and let's take some action in 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.